I'll be the third NIHIC that's presenting today, so if you're not asleep yet, hopefully you won't completely fall asleep. I'm going to talk a little bit what makes the National Institute on Drug Abuse, as well as all the various programs that the Institute participates, a little bit different. So a little bit about myself. So I think I have the world's most amazing job. I'm a business advisor to the Institute. I'm not a...
Can you speak into the microphone?
Here? All right. I feel like I'm having an intimate relationship with the microphone. And my role is to help NIDA evaluate assets, make sure that we do a good job promoting the program, but most importantly, help the companies that we fund make sure that they successfully move through the product development process. And then those companies and assets that are mature enough that we connect them to the right set of investors, strategic stakeholders. So as you know, NIH has many, many institutes. NIDA is one of those many institutes with a budget of a little bit over $1.4 billion. The mission of the organization is to advance science on the causes and consequences of drug use and addiction and to apply that knowledge to improve individual and public health. What most people don't realize, and what I never realized until I joined the Institute to help oversee the small business program, was the impact that substance use disorder had economic on our country and the world. For example, in 2015, under the Obama administration, there was a big task force to end the opiate epidemic. And it did a cost analysis where they evaluated that just for opiate use disorder, the cost to the country was a little bit over $500 billion. And you can quantify that based upon a percent of a GDP. So it's a huge problem, and a problem that is going to continue to persist. President Trump, under his task force, they did a similar analysis and saw the same result. And as a result of all this analysis and the opiate epidemic being so impactful to everyone across the country, NIH received additional funding through Congress. But unfortunately, despite that additional funding, everything that's been modeled to date demonstrates that the opiate epidemic, that the substance use disorder epidemic, no much how much money you're going to pump in as a government on a short-term basis, this problem is going to continue to exist in our country for the next 10 plus years unless we do some very drastic changes. And what's interesting about all of this is the role that private industry can play in order to address the opiate epidemic. And the sad truth is that aside from some private equity investment into the addiction treatment space, there's been very little interest from pharmaceutical companies, from venture capital firms to specifically invest in innovative technologies for a number of reasons. In 1988, Congress passed a law that set up the division under NIDA for medication development. We're the only NIH institute that is by law mandated to go and develop pharmaceutical products. No other NIHIC has that task or responsibility. They're really focused on basic discoveries and basic research for the most part. NIDA, one of our divisions, has the specific task of developing novel therapeutics for substance use disorder. This includes smoking, this includes opiate, cocaine, methamphetamine, various different substance of abuse. And this was actually some of the language that was used in the law, a tacit acknowledgement that the pharmaceutical industry needed incentives to consider medications development in the area of addiction disorder. And unfortunately, since 1988, not a lot has changed. Last year, Bayer released the second round of reporting looking at the investment of the VC community into the space. And they did a nice analysis looking at the clinical trials, the pipeline, the new medications, formulations of existing 3 medications that have been approved since the 1970s. And the dire truth is that you can literally count the number of clinical trials on your 2 hands that are currently in existence for phase 1, 2, and 3. And in terms of investment into the space, so the conclusion was that venture investment in U.S. companies with lead products in addiction have been virtually non-existent over the past 10 years. So really over the last 30 years, since 1988, when Congress mandated that NIDA invests funds into development of therapeutics, and today very little has changed. So for this reason, the way NIDA operates, the way we look at basic discovery, but more importantly, translational initiatives is extremely different. So today I'm going to talk about 4 programs and how unique they are on top of the all the other traditional programs that you heard about today. NIDA participates in R01s, they have an SBIR program. So all of those things are true for every single institute for the most part. It includes NIDA. I'm going to talk about the differences and the differences of how we've modified those existing programs so that we can be more responsive and more adaptive in regards to the development of pharmaceutical products, as well as therapeutics and other types of products and services. So the first is a medication development program to treat SUD through our Division of Therapeutics and Medical Consequences. The second is the Blueprint Therapeutics Network. The third is a really novel program that we just launched called Step Up for SUD, a drug target initiative. And the fourth is our SBIR STTR program. So NIDA, what's really amazing and unique is, as you know, the traditional review and funding process lasts anywhere between, in truth, between 6 and 12 months, depending on the institute. From when you submit an application to when the application gets reviewed, the institute has due diligence themselves. And then hopefully you get that notice of award as a company or as a researcher. It takes 6 to 12 months. For us, we realized that we needed to be much more effective, and our Division of Therapeutics and Medical Consequences launched 2 programs. The first was this development of medications to treat substance use disorder. It's a UG3, UH3 mechanism, and then a similar program was a UO1. And what we did was we reduced the amount of time that the projects were allowed to be funded for. So not the traditional 5-year R01 type mechanisms, but reduced it to 3 years. And then we significantly increased the budget to $5 million per year. So up to $10 million for a single project. And this has made a very big difference because the review panel itself is already formed, and they review the applications on an ongoing rolling basis, which is very, very unique. And you can actually get a funding decision, not just an update from the program officer of how the review process may have gone, but a funding decision within 8 weeks, which is extremely unheard of in government. And the use of this mechanism, so talking to our Kurt Rasputin, he said this has made the biggest difference in the world because we're able to attract large pharmaceutical companies like Takeda and Otsuka to participate and open up their portfolio of assets and pivot them to substance use disorder. But we're also able to work with smaller biotech companies who are extremely focused and don't have a lot of time to write long grants. The expectation is that they pursue their most developed assets rather than try to spread an extremely broad portfolio. So the more focused you are as a startup, traditionally, the better. This allows the division, the institute, to have that broader conversation and really to increase the number of applications, but more importantly, look at novel therapeutics that can actually be disruptive for the substance use disorder patient population. The second initiative that NIDA takes a really big hand in participating is a virtual pharma model. The NIH Blueprint Neurotherapeutics program. And what's extremely unique about this program is that the way that it is ran. It is a virtual pharma where the program officer predominantly ran through NIDAS gets assigned. That program officer is usually a project manager with significant industry expertise. So the program officers themselves know how to manufacture and develop drugs. NIDAS, NIDA, and other NIH institutes have also already have existing contracts, approximately 20 different consultants. And these are former vice presidents of pharmaceutical R&D who are retired or are consulting now. And we brought these amazing individuals and put this around the research team. And the expectation, because this is a U mechanism, that the milestones are going to be set. The team has bi-weekly meetings. So there's a very heavy hand. It's not just an SBIR grant or an R01 grant where it's you write a great application, here's the funding, come back to us in 6 months or in a year, let us know how things are going, and then put in that next grant application. This is really more hands-on. The additional difference also is that NIDA has negotiated contract with contract research organizations so that you as a company don't need to bring in all of these high expenses. So things like medical chemistry, we have a contract with MIRI, PK Talks, we do with SRI Institute, data management, formulation studies, all of those things are provided in kind as resources. And the way this gets funded is because multiple NIH institutes are participating in this is, for example, if there's a company developing medication for cocaine use disorder, this comes in, and if it does well and the NIDA decides to fund this through the program, we work with NIDAS to put a team around this. But the money for funding the project itself comes from our institute. So it's a broad NIH institute. So if you have any CNS type of molecule that's interested, this is a phenomenal program. It is very competitive. Even the review process itself is extremely well structured. There's not just 3 reviewers, but up to 5 reviewers assigned to the application. We make sure that physicians, drug development experts are reviewing the applications, not just academic researchers who may have a very specific and deep knowledge of one subject matter expertise. You really need to understand not only is the target interesting or novel, but can you actually get to that target within the body? Can you develop the formulation that's stable enough? The route of administration and the stability of the product based upon the target product profile, is that even possible or even worth developing? All of those things go into that funding decision process, but you need a really good review in order to identify all of those gaps. And the BPN network and that entire program does this. It's one of also the few initiatives where projects are killed on a, I don't want to say daily basis, but are routinely killed based upon the pre-negotiated milestones of the project. And then the funds that are not used for that project, because again, you can get up to $10 million per project over the length of it, they are reinvested into the program so that we can again bring in additional teams, additional companies into this. So this has had huge success. NIDA, I'm very proud to say we always kind of hijack a lot of this trans NIH initiatives. So NIDAS does a lot of the work, and then we bring a lot of the best companies that get funded. Their first big success story was with Elias Pharmaceuticals for developing of smoking cessation. The company inked a deal with AstraZeneca for $150 million for their smoking cessation. This project came through Paul Kenny in his lab. He was a PI that was fortunate to receive the support, and they just put an entire team around Paul, and he did a phenomenal job. He actually pitched the JP Morgan with a friend of his, and AstraZeneca came in and now put an entire team around the project. So the third initiative that I really want to highlight is really innovative. So as we know, within health IT and startups, there's been this drastic change of how we fund and develop products. We have a tight loop of feedback, of integration. We develop a product, we get feedback from the end user. And this has transformed the way we develop health IT products. And our thought process is with the success of accelerators, incubators like IndieBio, who have also demonstrated that you can reduce the timeline to get a project from point A to point B, not through the entire valley of death, but to actually get it to an inflection point. That's what's really needed for a company that has very early that is very early in the product development pipeline stage. So we're looking really for novel ideas. We're going to fund up to 50 projects, which itself is unheard of. It's $150,000 of direct costs, and we're only giving 12 months to the project. The idea is to come up with a killer experiment, not to just do an incremental modification tested in an animal study and say, well, this kind of looks interesting. I think we need to do a bigger animal study, or we need to tweak that bioassay. So we're bringing in additional consultants on this, similar to Blueprint Therapeutic. We're going to be putting an entire team, a lead team around each researcher. And this is also going to include a business development person. And this has never been done at NIH. There's 1 or 2 institutes that have brought in entrepreneurs in residence that kind of help and advise already funded companies. So I think NCI has 1 or 2, NHLBI had 2 or 3, and now NIH is trying to make this entrepreneur in residence program on an NIH level, but never has a business development or that level of due diligence been assigned so early. And I think this is just as critical as a company understanding what a target product profile is, as understanding what are the market. So for example, for addiction, if you're developing an monoclonal antibody, you need to understand, will insurance companies even pick up the tab for that type of biologic when they're not even picking up a tab for 30 days in treatment facilities right now. And you need to understand all of those economics. So it's applications are going to be due in a month. So we're really excited to see if we can apply all of these product development lessons that we've learned over the years and see if we can implement them for identifying novel targets and interesting research for substance use disorder. So we also provide a plethora of in-kind resources, all ranging from getting access to our drug supply program to running toxicology, and all of these are in-kind. It does take anywhere between 3 and 6 months to, depending on the program, to get access to these resources. And the fourth program that I want to talk about a little bit in great detail is our small business, our SBIRISTTR program, and I call this our ultimate translational program. And as we talked about earlier in the presentation, the substance use disorder, the addiction marketplace is very, very different from cancer. It's very different from infectious disease. To some degree, if you have a successful, promising cancer therapeutic and you have a strong preclinical data package and a tox study, most likely you can get acquired or you can get a licensing deal. It's not true with addiction. And specifically when I was brought in 5 years ago and when the office was being established to oversee the program, the Institute was having a difficulty time just spending all the funds responsibly into the program. It had something close to a 50% funding rate. And if you consider that there's a 50% cutoff rate for when you submit an application in the review process, it means that NIDA was funding 90+% of all the companies that came into the program and were fundable. Because of this, we implemented a number of various initiatives to make sure that we were increasing the number of applications that were in this space, and that we were, more importantly, selecting the most innovative, disruptive companies. And I'll walk you through some of the things that we've done, as well as, more importantly, the opportunities that are available to companies to leverage in regards to the small business program. I'm not going to have any slides about the details of how to apply or what's the difference between phase 1, phase 2, or SBIR or STTR. I think all the other institutes already hit on that. So I'm going to just focus on how things are done differently because over the space that we're in. So the first thing is we are very due diligent in regards to talking to various populations that are affected for substance use disorder. One of the first programs that we did was we published a request for information, and we asked the entire healthcare ecosystem, what are the problems that you're seeing within the addiction space that we can ask our small businesses to solve, to develop new novel product services. And after about a month, we had a tremendous response of 500 individuals. And of those 500 individuals, it was something like 490 were researchers. We got no response from patients. We got no response really from medical practitioners, insurance companies, investment communities, treatment providers. So we went and we did additional interviews. We tapped into our own networks. I was fortunate enough, I went to Baltimore, so we're in Bethesda, DC area. I went to Baltimore, just went from one treatment facility to the next and talked to the physicians as well as the founders of the treatment facilities. And as a result of this RFI, and this was the first one we launched the second one where we partnered with a nonprofit organization called Addiction Policy Forum. And what was great about Addiction Policy Forum was they had a Facebook group of something like 30,000 family members that were affected by addiction. So usually moms, dads, individuals that have lost someone or someone that's battling addiction and they just need some help. And within 2 days, we had 400 responses from patients. And these responses weren't just like 1 or 2 sentences that says, you should really invest in this area of research where I'm getting funded. It was really personal responses, 2-3 pages long, telling the story and the struggles that patients and their loved ones were facing. And we used all of this plethora of data to come up with a very comprehensive strategy in regards to what problems need to be addressed, and we published targeted RFAs. And one example of this, when we were scouting a company at 1776, which is for us a local VC accelerator, they're global now, similar to JLabs. We saw an emergency room physician, Nishi, was pitching, and the problem that she was solving at the time was finding an open bed for a patient when she was in an ER room. And she was on the phone constantly after treating a patient, and she couldn't find an open bed. After her presentation, I approached her and said, hey, we have the exact same problem for treatment facilities. Would you be interested in pivoting your technology? We'll help you explain the whole SBIR process. And she wrote a fast track and got successfully funded. What was interesting was that we also made sure that Nishi, because it's a health IT product, unlike traditional device or therapeutics, if you structure the phase 1 with business synergy in mind, you can get a really good return on investment where you can start to become self-sustainable. And for the phase 1, she partnered with the state of Indiana, and within $252,000, within 6 months, was able to demonstrate that within 17 treatment facilities within the state, that she could reduce the amount of time that a treatment provider spent looking for an open bed from something like 8 minutes because they were on the phone to less than 60 seconds using the software. Again, this wasn't very disruptive technology. I mean, I used the exact same app at Startup Health when I was scheduling meetings. Airbnb was around, for years before open beds. But it's such a blue ocean strategy because there's never been investment in this space. And at the end of this phase 1, the state of Indiana signed a multi-year contract with them and to roll this out across the entire state. For phase 2, open beds used the funding to go into 6 additional states. And then 12 months into the phase 2, the company got acquired by Apris Health, who is now rolling this out on a national level. So you can make an immediate impact within the space of addiction because the space has not been disrupted forever. And the technologies that have already been validated and proven in other indications for other things, you can pivot into our space and make an immediate impact on public health. Another big thing that we did, we really believe in data, and we also very believe in doing due diligence on ourselves. My boss actually had me evaluate whether or not the meetings and the feedback that I was providing to guidance on and mentoring, if that had an impact on their priority score or their commercialization success. So luckily, it did have an impact, but it was literally evaluate if you're doing your own job successfully. And another analysis that we did was we looked at historically over the previous 20 years of funding, what were good return on investments? Which companies that we fund with phase 1, phase 2 funding, what was their commercialization success? So as phase 3, as NIH defines it. And we saw that we were very good, surprisingly, in education, therapeutics, medical devices, and we were atrocious in health IT. Something like 0.6% of the companies that we funded or the grants that were given resulted in commercialization success. Commercialization success was defined as company having an IPO, getting acquired, having any type of decent sales on that product, or raising additional non-government funding, so venture capital, private equity. And we saw that we made 60% of investment to health IT, and they had the lowest return on investment. So we're really focused to ensure that we weren't funding the same companies that just kept writing grants. We also looked to see if the impact score, and as you heard today, some institutes just go by how well an application does in the review process. Within our portfolio, we look to see over that 20 years, if you have a phenomenal score, are you more likely to develop a product that's going to be a commercialization success? And we did not see any correlation. So for us, our funding decision process, the priority score is extremely important. And it's extremely important to have a really good review team. But it's one of 7 criteria that we use to evaluate whether or not we make a funding decision. And for this reason, last year we funded, of all the companies that we funded, roughly a third or close to 40% had never written an NIH SBIR grant before. We are really looking into entrepreneurial ideas. It's great if you have expertise writing grants and you want to putting an application in. 60% of the programs that we funded have written some kind of grant in the past before, but we are really looking into disruptive platform technologies, whether it's for development and identifying novel therapeutic targets, or whether it's new devices to treat neonatal abstinence syndrome. All of those technologies we're interested in. And one of the things that we work very closely, after reviewers provide feedback, if there are certain things that we can change, right, before making the notice of award after the reviewer has provided, but the significance or the team, there's really nothing else that the company can do, but it's within our hands, then we work very closely with grants management to make sure that the company addresses that within the phase 1 of their specific aims, and then we fund them. So that's one of probably the biggest difference between the way we run our small business program compared to many of the other NIHICs. So in addition, because of this space and because of all of this RFI initiatives, we have an opportunity to literally create new markets. One of the companies that we funded, Smokescreen, developed a smoking genotyping array, and then after the development of the product, they went and sold this to all of the smoking cessation researchers that were looking to use a research tool. And this came partially a result of that RFI that asked researchers, what kind of technology are you looking for? So again, it's the constant feedback from the end user which is extremely important for us because we don't want to make decisions from an ivory tower and say, you know, we think this is important. It's not just because one or two researchers said it. We really are looking for a more comprehensive approach. We also funded the first electronic standardized e-cigarette. So there's a very big problem in studying smoking cessation because traditionally researchers were using whether it was Juul or another manufacturer, and by the time the second year came into that researcher continuing the study, the manufacturer stopped selling that cigarette. So there was nothing standardized. There's no master file with the FDA, and we used the RFP mechanism, and we had a contract with a company called Enjoy to specifically develop a standardized electronic cigarette, which is now being used by clinical researchers across the country, so we can actually have apples to apples when we're doing the effect about electronic cigarettes and whether or not they're efficacious or not. So proper reproducible research. And so I'll stop there for them. As I mentioned, you have an opportunity to be the first when you're playing in this blue ocean. So for example, NIDA funded the first company, THERAPEUTICS, which was the first company to get FDA approval for a digital therapeutic. So now you as a patient can go to a doctor, and the doctor is going to prescribe, download this app, and then put in this code. And then a patient has the opportunity to download this app, get cognitive behavioral therapy for addiction. And it's a phenomenal platform, phenomenal regulatory strategy. And in truth, when I met with Therapeutics in Boston before they got their significant Series A's and Series B and then more recently Series C financing, what intrigued me was about their regulatory strategy. And at that time and even now, when you look for, I don't know, a smoking cessation app or a mental health app on iTunes or Google Play, there's like 10,000. How are we supposed to separate between what's garbage and what's actually good mobile app applications? And so I was really intrigued by the regulatory and the business strategy behind the company. And I think this was one of the key reasons as to why NIDA decided to fund this company. Ironically, this company just squeezed by in the review process because the reviewers saw that the cognitive behavioral therapy, well, that's been studied for decades. That's really not that interesting. You know, there's all these other apps that a patient can download. The novelty was seeing the business and the regulatory strategy. And it's those types of decisions, and we try to have our review be as diverse as possible to have not just brilliant academic researchers, but also have business and venture capital folks also evaluate the applications. So in addition, as I mentioned before, 5 years ago, there was just not enough good technologies, good companies, and we realized that we needed to nurture our own ecosystem in order to be able to generate new businesses. So we launched 2 programs which were very important. The first was we partnered with the Yale Entrepreneurship Institute to develop a custom curriculum that specifically teaches researchers that were interested in developing products or putting their foot in the water to see if they can start a startup, even if that idea is worth even considering. And as you know, even for the SBIRISTTR program, a phase 1, $150,000, it takes a while to set up the company, complete those 5-6 key registrations. You hopefully submit the application and you hit all the check boxes. Your application gets submitted successfully, and then 6 to 9 months later, you'll hear on whether or not you're going to be given the grant. That's too long. So with this, we did 2 things. One is we started educating individuals that are very, very interested. And it's a boot camp. It's phenomenal. We have venture individuals talking about commercialization, so VCs like Canon and New Enterprise Associates. We had folks from the FDA participate in the week. And throughout that week, teams are being taught about product development, therapeutics, health AT, diagnostics, and they're putting together their own pitch for Friday. But the pitch needs to include everything in terms of product development. And for most of you who hopefully already have startups or already successful biotech companies that are scaling, technologies may be second nature to you. But when you've never done anything related to product development, this is extremely helpful. What was extremely surprising to us, we thought that with this initiative, and that's very tiny, so I'm sorry if you can't read, I can't read that either. we thought we were going to get very early investigators, postdocs, maybe some very young tenure faculty that were kind of in the more innovative spaces of Boston and Stanford. What was very surprising to us was that we got a huge diversity in terms of age. So we had tenured faculty with 40 years and multiple R01s to very young investigators. We also got individuals that were developing things such as therapeutics and doing basic research, as well as devices, diagnostics. So not only was there a diversity in technology type, but also a diversity in age, skin color, sex, which is phenomenal for us. The second thing that we launched was something called Startup and SUD Startup. And this I mentioned, and for this, all you need is a 4-page white paper and a 2-minute YouTube video for submission. You just need to register on challenge.gov and that's it. And the idea behind this is for us to, again, get those ideas early and make sure that there are interested parties that want to start a startup, that they have an opportunity to just test that hypothesis. And then along with $10,000, each team gets our mentorship for 3 to 6 months. We develop a custom curriculum for each team, depending on the technology type that they're developing. And in parallel to this, in reality, they're putting together their first phase 1 or fast track application. And this was extremely successful. Some of the companies and assets that we saw have been extremely innovative. So for example, one really cool early investigators out of University of Washington, they convert your smartphone into a radar device that can detect respiratory depression. So they can literally kind of like Batmanize your phone, and if someone is taking drugs or is an avid heroin user, they can turn on the app in their device, put it right next to themselves, and it will monitor whether or not the device is going to, whether the person overdoses, and then it can send a signal for their immediate family or even a 911 call. So extremely groundbreaking. The technology is so cool, but again, these are young individuals. They don't have 30 years of research. They only have a handful of publications. We were able to kind of connect them with additional resources, clinical researchers, and the company was able to successfully get a phase 1. Now they're moving forward to a phase 2. So really disruptive technologies. And again, I mentioned 10 startups each batch. It's been very successful. Another company that we funded was Propeller. It's the first device to get FDA a breakthrough designation for the treatment of neonatal abstinence syndrome. So again, currently right now in hospitals across the US, there's a shortage of staff. Physicians have no idea what to do in regards to the NICU or how to care for these patients. There's even programs where volunteers can come into the hospital and just hold these newborns that have withdrawal symptoms. So then there's a shortage of any type of device, and the company submitted for the challenge program. Within 6 months, they went through our mentorship. They got phase 1 funding, and now they're in phase 2, and the device just got FDA breakthrough designation. And then lastly, over the last 5 years, as a result of all of these initiatives, we've had tremendous success in regards to our portfolio. We've increased the number of applications 400%. So we went from barely being able to use the funds to having about 10-15% of the applications that get submitted into the program get funding. So it is very competitive. But more importantly, because the portfolio now has some phenomenal companies that are doing Series B, Series C financing round, are getting FDA approvals. We partnered with the Milken Institute last year, where we bring 10 to 20 of our best companies, and we put them in front of a room of investors, as well as strategic stakeholders, because not every single company is going to require that additional capital at the time. But this includes payers. This also includes Medicaid, Medicare for individual states. So people that could really make a difference or can become additional purchasers of the technology, as well as the traditional venture capital firms. We do this in New York. It's been a huge success. And we're going to have another event in June with, again, our kind of next batch of companies that we think are mature enough that could benefit from either additional capital or additional access to resources. So this is just kind of a summary of all the opportunities and descriptions and due dates and all the links that I discussed. So this is all active links, and we'll make sure that the slide deck is available to everyone today. So with that, where do we start? It's very simple. You can email myself, or one of the 3 program officers, Irina, Leonardo, or Ram. So and I'll just give you kind of their portfolio. So Ram oversees therapeutics, Leonardo oversees devices, Irina oversees kind of direct-to-consumer, so education, research tools. And then Elena oversees the entire office. She's our office director. She reports directly to the institute director. And I think one of the biggest reasons why we were able to have so much success as a program is because of the support from our senior leadership team. All of these kind of slightly crazy initiatives, they've always been supported. Things that have not worked, we've stopped and we've kind of pulled out of in terms of funding. So if you're looking to really bring a disruptive technology or pivot into our space, we'd love to have a conversation with you. Just shoot us an email and briefly answer these 5 questions. And as you can see, these questions are very specific and they give us a lot of insight. Plus, we don't spend the 15 minutes of a 30-minute phone call getting to know each other. I want to know about the problem that you're solving, and I want to, more importantly, understand how I can help. So answer these questions. You can email that address or an individual program officer or myself, and we'll provide the best guidance that we can. So with that, love to take any questions, see how it can be helpful. Yes?
I wanted to know, are you also focused on alternative types of pain medication because of the whole opioid epidemic? Or do you fund those that kind of research and to identify pain markers?
Yeah. So the question is, are we interested in pain? So pain is very interesting because historically it's never been assigned to one institute within NIH. It's kind of been sprinkled over. If you have chemotherapy-induced pain, you can submit an application to NCI. But because of the opiate epidemic, and 2 years ago, NIH received $500 million to help address the opiate epidemic. And that funding was really broken up into 2 main parts. $250 million went to NIDAS, $250 million went to NIDA. But more importantly, they modified the guidelines within receipt and referral. Now there's very clear language about who gets what types of applications. So if it's acute or chronic pain, then NIDAS is the best home for it. If it's to treat opioid use disorder, it's NIDA. If you can reduce someone that is on chronic opioids, NIDA is also going to consider. So it really depends on the label. And so, for example, one of the companies that we funded, and again, you can use NIH Reporter to identify our portfolio, to do due diligence on us, and use the data against us, is Applied VR platform technology. But the specific label that they're going after with the FDA and we're having discussions with is opiate sparing. So traditionally for substance use disorder, it's always been 6 months abstinence. But the FDA is starting to realize that that is a very high bar, and they're also looking at other clinical endpoints. So there are conversations for if the device can demonstrate that a person is on an opiate and you can reduce the number of opioids, that would be of interest to us. So it's a little bit of a gray area, but again, acute pain, NIDAS, opiate sparing, we're interested, but it's going to depend on your regulatory strategy.
I was interested by NIDA and I was in contact with BRAMA, and I realized that you are starting to have a special program for the small molecule development.
So we did talk about the step up for SUD, specifically looking at 50 targets. Happy to talk about it in greater detail, but the idea is to fund really early work. And what's very kind of, I don't know, see if I have it. So, and under that initiative, these are all the studies that are included. So everything from validation of targets, or identifying new novel molecules, hit to lead, anything within that space. But we're also very interested in things that will get killed in any NIH review process. And that is, for example, repeating experiments, right? And we know that in terms of reproducibility, for example, one of the areas that we constantly get feedback from the venture community. Amgen had a huge trial, and then NIH launched this big reproducibility initiative, is that a lot of the research that gets published, it's based upon best results, not necessarily reproducible results. So under this initiative, we are interested in everything and related to identifying a target, even repeating experiments that you want to be more robust. Any other questions? Sure.
You put it at the very last before the appendix slide. contact your
The very last before, oh, the contact information?
contact your customers?
Sure. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I am here for maybe 2-3 more meetings. If you want feedback that's not going to be in the public domain and the secret sauce of NIH, happy to talk to you and spill all their secrets.
Regarding that, just a quick question on NIDA and NIH. What are the confidentiality kind of assurances, or how does that work?
So everything is confidential between a company and NIH. I have seen companies, especially pharmaceutical companies, even sign specific CDAs. So it is up to you and legal counsel, and that's the general language. If you're a small company or a startup, NIH isn't going to, we're not allowed to talk about other companies other than what is in the public domain, what you can find for yourself through, for example, something like NIH Reporter. So you don't need to put in a CDA. One thing that I always recommend when you're putting in your application, you can mark areas that are proprietary and confidential and should not be secret. Just mark the entire application. And then, I don't know if this is interesting, but because the Freedom of Information Act, we had 1 or 2 instances where companies were requesting the full application of companies that submitted something as a competitor. And in order to kind of ease your fears, what happens is NIH gets this request, and then the principal investigator in the company have an opportunity to black out whatever sections of the application they do not want shared. And I just advise the founders of the company, just black out the whole thing, leave your name. So because everything is confidential, it's not their business.
Could you just put up the in-kind slide?
Sure. And I promise we will share this. So, okay. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for listening. If you have any additional questions or you want to compare notes or portfolios or ideas, I'll still be available for a little while. Thank you.